He wrote By Performing Forces, the biggest symphony of all time, and then wrote 31 more, mostly as a senior citizen. I'm the Classical Nerd, and today we're talking about Havergal Brian. Havergal Brian was born with the real first name of William in January 1876 in central England. As a kid, he was a multi-instrumentalist who played string and keyboard instruments, but his main attraction was always to composition. He was enthusiastic about the subject, but was pretty much self-taught. The closest thing he ever had to a composition lesson was a few lessons on theory from a local teacher. 1896 was a turning point in his musical life as he heard a rehearsal of Edward Elgar's cantata King Olaf, and was thereafter hooked on the works of his English contemporaries, especially after going to that performance. He found it to be extremely interesting music. He was also very much enthralled with the works of Richard Strauss and Gustav Mahler, but he did not write them. He wrote to Elgar, and he was looking for composition lessons, not from him necessarily, but just a general bit of advice onto where he could get them. Elgar told him that he never really had any himself, which inspired Brian to go on his own way. The difference was that Elgar actually grew up around more music because he grew up a little bit wealthier than the working class Brian. Things seemed to be looking up for Brian in 1907, when his English suite was performed at the Proms under the baton of one of its main founders, the conductor Henry Wood. This led to a smattering of other performances, but this initial enthusiasm ended up waning. Why is a matter of speculation. It likely had to do with his shyness and the fact that he was uncomfortable with the kinds of self-promotion that he would have to do in order to get his own works performed. From the 1920s onwards, Brian entered a period of profound obscurity and neglect, and he really didn't seem to want to do anything to promote his own music. He did receive a modest yearly stipend from a local businessman that turned out to be around $17,000 in today's money, which is not enough money to live on, but was enough to keep him from having to compose pieces with better performing prospects. It allowed him to focus on the pieces that he really wanted to write, about which more in a second. World War I slammed the brakes on everything. Brian volunteered for service but never saw active duty and was sent home after he managed to get his hand injured. He thus had to start over in London, and whatever he may have done to get his name out there failed. He was still as obscure as ever. He and his family moved around, and he was able to get a few odd jobs here and there, but they were never truly able to escape the specter of poverty. By the end of the 1920s, however, Brian had become a bit of an expert in European musical goings-on, as he was hired to edit a journal called Musical Opinion. So he was known in certain circles, but he was steadfastly obscure otherwise. He had started writing symphonies around this time as well, and what he wanted to write is a strong contender for the grandest symphony ever written, the Gothic Symphony. The Gothic Symphony calls for the largest orchestra ever, and is only eclipsed in terms of length by a couple of pieces in any genre. There wasn't staff paper that was sold anywhere that could accommodate the upwards of 50 staves he needed, especially for Part 2, which includes a choir on top of the massive forces he was already calling for. Actually, that's not fair. He didn't call for one choir. He called for 5 choirs and soloists. The project of writing this behemoth of a piece took Brian the better part of a decade, and can be seen as one of the last gasps of the late Romantic era, with a size of performing forces that would make Mahler blush, and a handling of tonality that, while definitely tonal, is divorced from traditional tonal schemes that one would find in previous symphonies. It took after Mahler and the Danish composer Carl Nielsen in using progressive tonality. It begins in one key and slowly morphs into another. To truly answer the question of why he would write something like this is a question that we're going to have to save for a little bit later. Clearly he must have felt an inner artistic desire to write this piece, something that fueled him for this long a period of time without any hope of getting it performed. It's only ever had a handful of performances, and many of these include the services of ambitious amateur groups, because, how else are you going to get that many choirs together? It took 40 years for a professional premiere. The most recent as of recording this video was in 2011, when it was one of the first concerts to sell out at that year's Proms. pretty good considering that most people thought it was a work that wouldn't sell out on account of not many people had heard of it. Clearly, the legend of the Gothic Symphony preceded it. The work was dedicated to Richard Strauss, one of a handful of continental composers who knew of Brian and took him seriously, and he thought it was an incredible piece. The Gothic is said to be cursed, and there's even a documentary out there that plays up this supposed aspect, but the truth of the matter is that when you have to get over 1,000 people together for a rehearsal, just getting one rehearsal together is hard enough, let alone the kinds of rehearsal that you would need to put on a performance of the piece. And that's not even considering having to reserve a space for that many times for the number of rehearsals you need to put together the piece in the first place. I mean, there's so many moving parts to putting together a performance. The Gothic Symphony is also much more difficult to put together than, say, Mahler's Eighth Symphony, the so-called Symphony of 1,000, because there are more performers involved in the Gothic Symphony, and there aren't nearly as many performances and recordings of it, so choirs and orchestras have to learn the music new. They don't really have the luxury of having that piece solidly within the repertoire. It is still somewhat divisive amongst conductors and critics, who consider it either a masterpiece of masterpieces or this weird thing which defies all conventions of symphonic logic. And yes, people make comparisons to Mahler quite a bit, but probably the best comparison is to Hector Berlioz, based on how much the music baffles people, and how unusual it is, vis-a-vis the times in which it was written. And indeed, there are elements of the Gothic that are unusual in their settings, and some of Brian's compositional decisions can rightly be questioned. Part of this has to do with the fact that he was a self-taught composer, which, when you look at the piece, is just an incredible thing to think about. But regardless of what the critics and other musical talking heads say, it is universally loved by audiences whenever it is performed. Its attempts to bring together all music, from the Middle Ages to these Edgar Varese-like brass and percussion outbursts, are what makes it a unique part of musical history, and what drives people either towards it or away from it. Brian's productivity and his uniqueness as a voice within the genre of the symphony can be attested to the fact that he successfully towed the line between two dominant and polar opposites on the artistic spectrum. On one hand, you had Gustav Mahler, who said that a symphony should be like the world and embrace everything, while on the other hand you had Jean Sibelius saying that the symphony should have an inner drive and an inner logic to it. Brian synthesized these two opposite poles of expression, and this meant that no one really knew how to categorize his music. Combine this with his reputation for writing these large and unplayable works, a reputation, by the way, based solely off the size of the Gothic Symphony, and you can understand why conductors were shying away from performing any of his pieces. His personal life also wasn't in the best shape. He was rumored to be a wife-beater and an alcoholic, and he indeed cheated on his first wife with a servant girl who ended up becoming his second wife. He often exhibited paranoia and was generally cantankerous. At one point, he accused his neighbor of poisoning his tobacco, and he was also convinced that there were people in the musical world who were working behind the scenes in order to prevent his pieces from getting performances. So, in the big scheme of things, you can kind of understand how he wasn't the easiest of people to get along with, and being congenial and likable is rule number one if you want people to play your music. They have to like you first. On the other hand, to his friends, he was an incredibly warm person, sympathetic to the ups and downs of their lives, a friend who genuinely cared about how they were doing. In examining anecdotes of his life, we see a portrait of a man who believed passionately in whatever he said, even if whatever he said turned out to be not true, or contradicting what he said 5 minutes previous. Things began to turn around in the 1950s, when the producer Robert Simpson and the conductor Brian Fairfax discovered Brian's music and were aghast that such a composer had been so profoundly neglected, especially in a Britain that was still trying to shed its label of a land without music. At this point, Brian had written 8 symphonies, and the first to be performed was indeed his 8th. The 78-year-old composer was, naturally, at the premiere. Various radio broadcasts also brought to light many of Brian's other works. When he was 82, he moved to the south of England, where he dedicated himself to symphonic composition, managing to write 20 works in the genre in the next decade, before finally putting down his pen for good. His final output was a whopping 32 symphonies, which isn't bad by any measure, though on top of that, the fact that he finished 14 of these when he was in his 80s, and 7 more when he was in his 90s, and Wow. Hashtag goals. Now you're probably wondering how he managed to put out so much if the Gothic took him almost a decade of work. And the answer is that these pieces are much smaller in scope and scale. These later works are usually 1 or 2 movements long and retain a penchant for unusual constructions. But as he got older, his musical language became more refined. In his last few symphonies, it's said that he packaged about an hour's worth of material in 15 to 20 minutes. Brian stayed mentally active even after he stopped composing, and it seemed that he could at any point return and write his 33rd symphony. But he never did. He fell in November of 1972, and he passed away from complications of it at the hardy old age of 97. Amongst those who knew and championed his works, he was regarded as not just an English composer, but a specifically working-class English composer. Almost every other composer of British origin had been born into some wealth. His detractors saw him as some doodling, naive old man without any solid training, while his champions saw him as unjustly neglected. Many in the latter camp believe that if Brian's works were composed today, or even by someone other than Brian, they'd be hailed as masterpieces and put their composer on the map. Another factor, which is quite big, is the fact that musical style changed after World War I, and then again even more radically after World War II, and he was stuck writing in what was really a pre-World War I style. His more English-sounding idiom just didn't hold water for a lot of serious musicians. Marches, as much a working-class genre as anything else, are all over his music, and his orchestrational style is mostly dominated by the brass, whereas the typical orchestrational methodology as you'd see in, say, Brahms would be to write for the strings and use the other instruments more sporadically as a coloristic effect. Brian's language instead revolves around the brass instruments and using them as the focal point of an orchestral piece. Recordings of Brian's works have come in the years after his death. Not a note of his music was released commercially while he was still alive. These recordings are often backed by a variety of sources, including the Rex Foundation, an arts promotional charity founded by members of the Grateful Dead. While his champions have found this a sad state, and one they wish to rectify as much as possible and as soon as possible, Brian himself was never really all that concerned by it. Brian said that his primary interest was getting his pieces written, not performed.